Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway, although today it's quite calm, actually. Fingers crossed. And I have these two parrots that have been squawking by. Hopefully you'll get some bird sound more than highway sound. Who knows? We'll mix it up. But as some of you might be able to see and possibly have noted from the title of this piece, we are getting back into our monthly Clarkesworld reviews. We were a little bit behind. Last month was swamped. Other work sometimes gets into an author's life, but I am always looking forward to touching base with actual fiction when we talk about industry, even though the way I talk about fiction is always going to be through industry, because there are many approaches to doing book reviews and short fiction reviews. I prefer to think about things a little bit more holistically. I certainly will, in these pieces, make comments about certain stories that are a little bit more to my preference, but I'll try in the process to talk about broader trends that are emerging and that are definitely showing up through these tales, and using some of these tales to touch on bigger themes. Now, some of you might remember from an earlier video that Clarkesworld has thankfully finally recovered some of the losses from Amazon definitely pulling a bait and switch with a magazine program that it cultivated in such a way that it captured market. It made it pretty much the only real game in town, itself that game in town, and then changed the terms of the agreement in keeping with what Cory Doctorow has called enshittification. It's a very clever model to gut value from our industry. And as I've talked about elsewhere, that is the artificial intelligence we really have to worry about, is that corporate overreach which comes from a monopoly-based industry. We have so many pressure points right now, and our economy is fragile. There are definite stressors placed on a lot of work in the publishing economy. One thing I have always appreciated and admired about Neil Clark is that he has been talking about this for years. He has carefully gathered data, he shares data, he tries to build conversations with other editors and the community in general about the importance of supporting work that you care about, and definitely the importance of thinking about how to get more publications to a gold standard from older industry. So you might have heard me say that some of the losses from Amazon's bait and switch have been recovered, and yet not all. Clarkesworld, before this difficult transition, was ambitiously trying to get this publication, which was the first major science fiction publication to launch in an all-digital format, to considerable success, to the point where it too can provide actual living wages, a real income, to the editors behind the scene, to the staff behind the scene, in the same way that publications like Asimov's, Analog, and fantasy and science fiction have been able to do in the past. This would truly mark a threshold that the digital economy for science fiction has not met, which is itself extremely painful, because we are supposed to be the dreamers of better dreams. We are supposed to be the ones who are singing the praises of possibilities that are presented to us by our digital economy and a variety of other speculative touchstones, imagining futures to come. And yet, our own industry practices have not been in keeping with that better dream. We have put ourselves into positions where there are a tremendous number of people trying to get by, trying to make it in an economy that does not have space for all people or most people to be able to achieve any kind of success. And even then, and I should put this in the show notes, there was a wonderful piece that we just had on the SFF blog a little while ago, in which we talked about the fact that there's a bit of nostalgia going into the idea that any era was intrinsically filled with promise for most. What really kind of happened in some of those golden eras is that you had a few people who were willing to just crank out content. They burned through their existences in very minimalist ways, cutting corners, scraping things together to achieve those levels of fame that we sometimes glorify now and set as a ridiculously high standard. And of course, in those eras, that demographic most likely to be able to achieve these things was certainly not from people who are responsible for child rearing. So a lot of women were certainly not going to be allowed those same opportunities within the cultural pressures that existed. Obviously, there were a lot of issues with any non-white participant in genre, so BIPOC representation was definitely out the window. People with significant disabilities would not be able, or when I say significant, I mean any kind of disability that would require accommodation might not have been the easiest match. There were a lot of things that already in that golden era winnowed the population. So sometimes we have this fuzzy view of things that doesn't help us think about better standards now. Right now, we have two interesting issues. We have a large number of people who are definitely part of the quote-unquote creative class who are doing this kind of white-collar labor or pursuing it or trying to, sometimes with jobs, actually quite a few with jobs or with some kind of stability elsewhere, maybe a partner, and many in an aspirational sense. On top of that, we have, through the digital economy, a world of people who are seeing sometimes phenomenal payment rates for these publications in the context of their own local currencies. And so there's a huge push for a lot of folks from other regions to use this outlet, use this genre as a way of easing the economic pressure, the socioeconomic disparities that have existed in our world in general. And that's a lot of pressure for science fiction and fantasy to fix the whole world and the whole world's economy. Clarkesworld in particular has always been on the cutting edge of paying its writers really well within our genre, and that means that it also is more quickly targeted for scams, because a lot of people from other countries are just going to see the opportunity in open digital economies like this in an otherwise closed financial world to try to get a little bit of stability. That doesn't mean they aren't writers. It doesn't mean that they aren't also thinking, oh, I'd love to have a creative life, but there are many different pressures informing our ecosystem. So we have local folks who, in tremendous numbers, are aspiring to some kind of career in creative practice in an economy that itself is very gig-based, that is not prepared for a post-work ecosystem where we do not actually need most people and not most jobs, but quite a few jobs are already recognized to be fairly redundant or kind of filler labor, and it takes away our joy, it takes away our motivation, which tends to be filled with these aspirational hopes of finding that sense of purpose within these more expressive forms of existence, which is wonderful. We just have to figure out the economics of that. We have to figure out how to be able to pay staff, how to support one another better, and that's something that existed before AI, quote-unquote AI. It certainly has been exacerbated by corporate monopoly, but we have to take that very seriously. So one of the reasons that I quite enjoy reading Clarkesworld is that I do find the ethos behind the page to match the page itself. I've mentioned this before, Clarkesworld pulls from slush all the time, which means that I'm always going to be meeting someone new on the page, which is terrific. On the cover, you're not going to get any prioritization of one author over the others. Nobody is solicited just because of their name brand to try to sell the publication. There is a real focus on bringing folks in and advocating for translation and translators. There's so much done here within reason, within bounds, and we came very, very close to losing this publication this year. So if you haven't already, please do subscribe to it and keep the conversation going, because Neil Clark has put that data out for years, but it is something that we have to do as a team. We really do have to think about the fact that if we're going to be reliant on crowdfunding, if we're going to be reliant on annual campaigns and subscription models, we do need to develop an ecosystem that is aware of that as a kind of baseline, and that really pushes for those standards. and especially because Clarkesworld is special. Many publications that came after it have followed this model as well. The publication has free-to-read stories. It trusts that you, as the reader, are then going to recognize the value and support the work. And others have come through following that model, forging ahead. We now have a lot of publications like that. But there was a time when this was extremely rare and it was considered unwise. And even now, the gold standard for the older publications, the ones that are able to staff and pay their staff properly, do not have that model. So it's much harder to read an analog story or an Asimov story or a fantasy and science fiction story if you are not a direct subscriber. Other publications have this interesting hybrid model where subscribers get early access, and then later on, slowly over the course of the month, everybody else will get access to the rest of the fiction, and that's a clever workaround too. But these are necessary conversations. We have to figure out how to make sure there is money and capacity for all of the writers, and we also, to that end, need to improve our broader society so that folks aren't relying necessarily on the income from this work to live, just because everything else is falling apart, because there are profound global inequities that science fiction cannot fix on its own. So to be a good ethical science fiction reader, yes, I would advocate you need to be a good democratic thinker. You need to vote well. You need to think about social action that you can do in your community. You need to think about social uplift. You have to be thinking holistically if we're going to build an economy that serves creative practice best going forward. So I want to say I'm going to get off my soapbox, but no, we're just going to go into the issue now. So let's go into Clarkesworld, the August edition. I want to say as I start two things. One, the theme for this piece, or the overall touchstone that I seem to pull out of these stories, was a lot of focus on relationships. There's a lot more romance and family bonds and the idea of connection in many different ways, which I think is really beautifully intimated in the cover chosen as well. But see for yourself how these stories fit together. Sometimes when people are going to a magazine, it's because they have a friend or a favorite writer who has a piece in it, and then they don't read the rest. And I think that's a darn shame, because some of these stories are really good paired reads. And I'm also going to recommend in today's list a paired read, not just from this issue, but to a piece earlier this year. So when you read consistently a publication, you do pick up some phenomenal through lines, and you get to see how the same theme plays out in different hands, which I find just adds to the experience. So I highly recommend reading the whole issue. I don't know, I guess that ambulance in the background is urgently thinking about other things. Yeah, there we go, it's passing. But we're going to take that ambiance, that sense of urgency and excitement, and use it for our review. The second thing I wanted to say was that I do describe the covers, and partially I do this because I am occasionally extremely fortunate to get the benefit of being asked by people who do not have, blind people or people who have low vision might not be able to see the screen. And as a result, there is an opportunity, and again, it's a gift when somebody specifically asks for this, to be able to try to articulate something visual in another medium. And I highly recommend this as a practice for fellow writers, simply because it's not as easy as one might think, and it does take a little bit of work to do well. So I sometimes fumble with it myself, but I really do enjoy the exercise. So if you're not able to see this lovely cover, which is called Dandelion by Marcel Deneuve, the name definitely gives a sense of what you're looking at. But I have a feeling that those who are able to see it will already be able to connect the dots. Dandelion, of course, has seeds which in that soft, fuzzy form are going to burst from the sphere of the plant at a certain season and spread in the wind. And this cover is sort of top-down aerial view at these white objects They are machine-like. They're very clear. They might be stations, pods, and they have a very mechanical feel to them, but they also have a shape that invokes the dandelion seed. Not as fuzzy, obviously, cleaner, metallic, but beautifully contrasted in this stark white geometric materiality that feels constructed, obviously, human-made, against this backdrop of the rest of the atmosphere. It's almost they're descending over a world, and though the blue in the background suggests more of a water world, it could be ours, it could be somewhere else, but that sense of something expanding and seeding a new world is very much present here. The color choices are also really important, because I, for one, take these muted blues and this white to together suggest something fairly tranquil. If this had been done in a different color palette, it might be more menacing, the idea of seeding a world with something intense. But this is a very positive suggestion of scattering and growth through the generations to a new space. And I think that ties in well with the fact that we have here some stories that really think about generations and family connection as we grow into new environments. So, in contexts, let's take a look at the issue itself. We're going to start, as always, with the fiction. And then, of course, we have the nonfiction, which is just a gift. There's some wonderful work always in Clarkesworld to share. Okay, the first piece is The Time Capsule by Alice Towey. And this piece has a bit of a future Western commune setting. So there are very rural formal elements. It's almost like the United States has gone back to a formality from a different era because of a tremendous amount of fallout. And we have a main character who is trying their best to navigate the fact that their homestead is in debt to a neighboring homestead. And these settlements have their little power plays, which feel fairly mild to start, but become quite sinister by the end. And this is important to keep in mind, because there is an aesthetic of comfort in old traditions and a return to the old ways, which I think we need to hold in tension with the fact that it is a very fragile facade that's being maintained, with neighbors that are quick to lean into violence, that are quick to dispense with the rules, sort of etiquette of the land. It's not quite the idyllic space that it's made out to be. Now, those elements are pretty plainly presented in the work, so I'm not sure to the extent to which the author wants us to think about whether the happy ending that is achieved here is really that happy, or if there has been a compromise made, a brutality that has resurfaced that is going to continue after this adventure. But this adventure comes from our protagonist finding a probe that has fallen from the skies, and it carries information from another era. And at first it's wonderful, fascinating. There are recordings that allow our protagonist to connect with another lifetime and another person's hopes and dreams, a different aesthetic. But unfortunately, the danger that is caused by one settlement being under the thumb of the other is extended to the fact that the leader of this other settlement is not going to play fairly once they find out that this technology has landed on this land, and they are going to do what they can to try to take it. And there's an intimation that they're going to use it for ill ends. And I'm cautious about the word evil, so I hesitated there. But again, as much as the story finds a solution, there is that sense that just keeping the probe from the neighbor and sacrificing any possible benefit that might exist in it is not going to fix the main problem, that there is still this hard edge to this near future existence, or maybe slightly farther future existence, after a current world of climate change, fascism, violence has come to a head. apparently there's going to be this return, but it's not really a return to anything idyllic. It is a fragile piece, which when I read this piece, I felt as though had already been shattered in a serious way that needs reckoning. But the story ends with the solution to the probe and the situation of the probe alone. So it creates a world for sure that we can sit with and we can question, and it has a little romance along the way. The next story by Thomas Ha is called The Sort, and it is a very highly gentle story about a father, or I'm going to say the father. I've written father, so I'm sure that it is something in the text was coded for that. Otherwise, I'm usually very cautious and I go with parent. But the parent and the child are moving through a landscape that is a little more rural than their usual, a little more remote, and a little bit more tradition-based, which usually wouldn't be a problem. It's always good to explore, take in new sights. The child here struggles with speech, in part because the child and the parent can communicate mentally. And so it's difficult and a really interesting, chewy challenge to try to get a young person to use other modes when they are much more comfortable with the communication pattern that they have. So they pass through a small town with a town ritual of dividing good garlic from bad. It's a seasonal affair, kind of rustic. Everyone gets involved, and the children get involved. The children are the ones that decide good garlic, bad garlic by tasting it, and then spitting it out and condemning it. Even though it's supposed to be fairly innocent, it's just about differentiating crop yields. There is a very clear, deeper lesson that is also taught about good and bad in general. So this story offers meditation on belonging. And I really would love to pair this reading for listeners to Luc Diamant's Off Track, which was in the June edition, because both stories are adjacent to real-world issues and discussions, but they do this excellent work of creating a situation that is entirely of the story instead of a direct analogy to the world that we have. So Off Track has some really interesting themes that you can connect to the idea of the treatment of trans persons in school, and this one similarly can be connected to the treatment of people of autistic people, and yet it's not explicitly directly a story about autism any more than Off Track is explicitly directly a story about trans. It is a touchstone. It is a space to reflect not on some issues in our world like that, while still existing as its own deeper meditation in general on how we discern and how we separate. So really lovely, thoughtful piece there. The next one is also a story by a seasoned hand, Molum, 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 the Scourge by Rich Larson. And Rich Larson is just such a wonderful storyteller. You know, when you're reading a Larson story, you're going to be thrown into a different world, a rich world, and it's going to be gritty usually. It's going to be highly attentive to the fact that this world is going to have its own vocabulary, its own customs. It's just quite immersive. I'm pretty darn sure that I'm going to be putting a Larson story on my year-end list. Possibly not this one, but it was still quite a fun read. It's got a thoroughly engaging intensity to it. Molum is an old-school gladiator in obviously a futuristic setting where there are different modifications used for the wrestlers of their day. You can get a strong sense in the story of wrestler culture for sure, but just boost the drugs, the intensity of the setting, and the contests themselves just seem extremely brutal in many different ways. So it's just taking it to a whole other level. The Molum right now is not just old school, he's also sort of at the end of his career. And that means that some of the modifications that were so useful when he was in top form are now leaving him with an addiction that is very difficult to maintain. So he's left scavenging for implant feed to keep his senses sharp, because he's using these modern technologies, or they've been embedded in him, that have just left him in a really vulnerable state. He encounters a younger, highly admiring fan, calls himself Kidge the Kill Switch, so aspirational as well. And Kidge has this inside tip on some really primo stuff. And so the two of them get together for a heist. They pull off a job at something called the Black Tongue, and the entire time the kid is constantly crowing about Molum's career highlights, which should be a warning sign for us. So there's going to be a twist in the middle of it. But there's also this deeper thread through the story about the damage that we do to one another and to ourselves in the name of sport. And the ultimate commentary in the piece has this added interesting reflection on how sometimes the people we think of in the moment as enemies might actually be trying to help us protect ourselves from ourselves. It's just that we're going to take too long to see how they have been trying to do that work in an economy, in a context, in a culture that really just doesn't allow for any forgiveness for oneself. So the story gets to be about some really deeper themes, while also just being a fun brawl of a read. As many of Larson's stories are, just throws you right in, and you're supposed to just go along for the ride. The next piece is Something Crossing Over, Something Coming Back by Timothy Mudie. And this one is one of those stories in which you are just expected to accept the sci-fi premise. It is a sort of hand-waved concept of consciousness transfer. Now, there's some parts of the story try to explain how this works. Some meditation about whether what they're transferring is something technical, or whether it's, the deeper consciousness or of a spiritual nature. Things that on the surface you might say, okay, this seems like really bad science and pretty hokey. That's not the point of the story. So just accept it. Accept the premise is that in a world where consciousness transfer is possible, one side of this rivalry in the world has the capacity to do these swaps, and another one is still working to that end. So of course the first side wants to stop them from being able to harness the same technology. To do that, our spy spends a lot more time than they had hoped to, thanks to a damaged relationship for early extraction. So they are stuck in the mind of Zealand, which means they're stuck in Zealand's marriage and living context, life in general. And this is done in a very delicate way, I have to say. It's a tough theme to have a character talk about going into another person's mind and then sleeping with their wife. We would call that absolutely a form of dishonesty amounting to sexual assault. The way this story does it is that they craft a sense that Zealand is still in the mind with our protagonist. So it is Zealand who wants to be with his wife. Tricky to pull off as a writer. I think that's probably the best solution that could have been come up with here. And if the narrator ends up still being someone that you despise, that's good, in the sense that that's where the story is ultimately going to land, is that there's no easy forgiveness for what the narrator has done. But the story ultimately is this meditation about the consequences of spending that much time in somebody else's mind thinking you know them. Meanwhile, Zealand's consciousness has been transferred to the narrator's body. So they, all this while in captivity on the other side, while the narrator is sabotaging scientific efforts to improve technology on the other side of the political divide, Zealand is learning about the narrator. And the narrator is so excited to finally meet Zealand in person after the end of their engagement. But that ego, that arrogance, that ugliness, which has been presented as carefully as it can be throughout the story, does come to a pretty important reckoning at the end. And that ego is a major theme in the work. So a deftly done psychological study. So it's more sci-fantasy in certain ways, but with a complex character that will give you lots of food for thought. The next piece is Canyon Dance by Rajeev Prasad, and this one is one of those stories that does such an excellent job of establishing its worldview from the outset. And it especially takes on a character position for which religion is very important, faith is very important, and yet is very interesting tension because there are many different kinds of faith and trespass and doubt that can exist in life, and this protagonist struggles with them in 3 dimensions. So they've got faith is important for this protagonist, family is really important for this protagonist, and breaking faith from family is really hard too. It does, however, sometimes happen because of addiction. So we have these 3 kinds of compulsive energies, these drive to consume, drive to be present and with family, and drive to be deeply connected with faith. It's tough. The story also, in a very nuanced way, reflects on migration, and there's just a lot of wisdom here. So ultimately, it's a meditation on migration as an ongoing journey, and in that journey, there's no real end point. We're always taking ourselves with us, for better or for worse, and we still need to work on ourselves, and the journey of self often goes on longer than the actual concrete geographical move. In this case, this family wants to leave Earth for another possibility on a planet through the guild system. So there's a definite other network, another way of living in which they can prime themselves to undergo a tremendously arduous colonization process. It requires significant biochemical enhancements, for which Lavinia, Newt's wife, takes more readily, and Rhea, their daughter, is also working to figure out her path and where she wants to move. But Newt, even though he wants to rise to the challenge, even though he has so much faith in his heart, even though he has a deeply spiritual relationship to everything that's going on, also has his alcoholism, and that carries through the story. So it's an extremely nuanced look at the fact that migration is not a quick fix, and nothing is easily solved by going away, even to live under a different sun. You take yourself with you. So again, stories like this allow us to really sit with some deeply human themes, using that slight science fictional element to set the stage. The next piece, The Deformed Saint in the Poison Wind by David McGillveray, is a piece that starts from an alien perspective. The alien is dancing ritualistically to try to fend off the poison wind and its sickness from their shores. Then we move to a ship that lands, Courier 261, which is fleeing a Hool vessel in a time of war. So Helena seems like a really damaged mess of a being to the locals because she doesn't have the same form as the rest of them. But she does communicate with 2 of them, and through this communication and this connection with the tribe, she learns that they have been afflicted not by anything native to their own culture, but radiation poisoning from her war. So there's this opportunity here for one very damaged being who seems so poorly and weak and in all their differences to have perhaps some ability to help the locals in a different way. There's bonding, there's a sense of community. in this piece across species. The next piece, Where My Love Still Lives by Emily Taylor, is a more epic, lifelong notion of love. It pairs really well with the last of the stories in this issue. Both of them are about long distance, in this case, not just distance, but over long periods of time, love between people, even in very complex contexts. So we have an Earth where the surface has been overrun by mindless automated builders that continue to consume existing life and replace it with spores. So humanity has gone underground. It lives in connected basements and caverns and passageways. And this means there are essentially two kinds of survivors. One which is focused on trying to make that underground life work, and that's represented by Augie. But our focus is on Ruby, who glides through the air above ground as a harvester trying to find food on the surface. So there's this sense, there's a little bit, I have a little bit of a question about why it's so long, but for decades they've been apart, which makes me wonder what's going on in terms of the transport system, from harvesting food to take back to others. Is there no way for Ruby to check in before? Is there no way for them to live in sync? That, to me, I didn't quite see why there's been that distance. But in the premise of the story, for whatever reason, Ruby's time surface side means that she and Augie, even though they love each other, even though they definitely could have maybe built a life together, have instead built lives very much apart because they have different approaches to survival. Love still exists despite that. And that is a nice pairing with Marisca Pichette's, or Pichette. The story is 3 Circuits of the Monoceros Ring by Marisca Pichette. And it is a slender read. The last one in the issue for the last little while has been as such. And it follows 3 astronauts who are setting out on different journeys across the cosmos. They write to each other about their art and their love, and the story culminates in wedding vows at a distance. So it is about this trio and how they have found ways to bond and share care even though they are very far apart. So again, this is an issue really very much focused on relationships, familial, communal, sometimes across whole species, but there's that tender sense of bonding that does seem to be a dominant theme this time. Or the struggle to bond in the case of Prasad's piece, because it can be so hard when we still have work to do on ourselves. Then we move into the nonfiction. We have a piece this time by Wole Talabi, and this is Motherland Dreaming, Notes on African Speculative Fiction from Past to Present, and it has data. It's a really fun read for its data. So Talabi draws on his own work. He's been maintaining a database from 2016 to 2022 of published speculative work by African authors for the African Speculative Fiction Society, and this has allowed him to craft a really strong introduction to African science fiction here. We have sections on its roots, its characteristics, its history, and its contemporary trends. I should always say, never meant to be so comprehensive that there aren't other ways of looking at any of this. Of course there are. This is one representation. The article offers charts on distribution figures from 1921 to 2021. But 2021, I will say, when you look at the charts, the distribution is very much skewed towards the latter half of the spectrum. Nonetheless, it's done by country, by population percentage, by GDP, by urban inhabitants, and this creates some clear associations between urbanity, higher GDP, and more published work. Shock, gasp. Keep that in mind when thinking about how to build economies at scale that serve more creative writers in general. We also have statistics for gender, genre, and form. Along with there's a huge skewing effect to the last 10 years for overall publication figures. Historical lists also allow for other periodization. I will express a little bit of caution about that last 10 years, that spike though. That's something that's been worrying me for a while, because it suggests a trend cycle within the Western publishing context. It needs to be treated as not just a trend cycle, but a new era of much more global science fiction here to stay, supported as such. And ideally, work like this will help us create those other strong science fictional hubs around the world. We're trying to see it in Brazil. We're trying to see it in, well, we certainly are seeing it in China. But we would love to get to a point where we don't have this notion of the West being gatekeepers simply because the West has, all the cash. We need to make sure that there are funding models that support local authors within resilient and absolutely wonderful hubs that other people want to be published in. Ideally, we get to the point where people are clamoring to get into publications that are set in the African continent. That would be terrific from around the world. And to have that high standard of people desperately hoping to be recognized in African award circuits, the same way that they are right now more focused on being recognized within North American award circuits and European. So we'll get there eventually if we can figure out a way to support local creative hubs better than we have, and that's going to require a lot of focus, not just within the genre, but in overall social equity, overall thoughts about how to build a better world, but not going to be done in one episode, so we'll move on. As always, we have some wonderful pieces by Arley. Sorg does the interviews, and so the two are just giants in the field. Whew. Not like, sometimes what I really love about these interviews is they'll deal with people who, not deal with, it sounds like they're dispensing with, but they will address people who are at all stages in career, and maybe folks who have a really rough go of it or struggling for many years before getting that wonderful breakout event. In this case, though, just two tremendously established people who can provide a really thoughtful look at the run of their career, still in process, obviously, but with so much to share, so many highlights about the journey. So we start with Expanding on Traditions, a conversation with Jonathan Strahan, who was born in Ireland but grew into science fiction in Australia, with a little time spent in California, too. He is a giant in the editorial side of things. He's an editor and publisher, focuses on anthologies and single-author story collections. He's worked for Locust, Tor.com Publishing, and, of course, also maintains the wonderful Coode Street podcast, which I should probably talk about on another episode. I should note to self, we'll do that, with Gary K. Wolfe. His latest anthology is New Adventures in Space Opera. It's out at Tachyon. He talks about the challenges for anthology markets and the differences between reprint and original publications. And, of course, there's the question of what is a space opera, and that's a nice chewy debate, too. And the next piece is very much alive, an interview with Nnedi Okorafor, and Ohio-born to Igbo parents. Okorafor has a long and strong history of publication, from 2010's Who Fears Death to The Akata Witch in 2011 to Lagoon in 2014 to the Binti novella trilogy, which not only boosted her, but absolutely brought back the novella. It was part of a newly launched series from then Tor.com that reinvigorated the format as its own standalone publishing object, something you could find in the shelves again. That was a rare delight. So that was not just a personal win, but something that moved the genre forward to being able to accommodate this wonderful format again. So that gained great prominence from 2015 to 2018. Her latest, Like Binti, is a novella trilogy, although that's a little bit of a lie. We have two pieces here that she has coming out. Just extremely prolific. She Who Knows is the name of the novella trilogy. Fire Spitter is the first piece. It belongs to the universe of Who Fears Death. It launched in August. And then she also has Death of the Author, due out in January, and that's more of a piece of memoir, meta-narrative. So in this, there's so much here to talk about. Okorafor talks about being drawn to a character and what that means, and how she was moved to tell more of that character's story, about the persistence of patriarchy and gender issues, even in far-flung future societies, which is a really interesting note and challenge, because a lot of people will try to imagine societies that maintain today's cultures and carry today's cultures forward without acknowledging that many of today's cultures do have major problems in them. So if you're going to carry the culture forward to the future, you're going to have to deal with the ugly bits that'll still be hanging around. And then I'll get to the talk about Death of the Author. It's a deeply personal story, very difficult to write because it talks about the Nigerian American experience. There's just so much here. So that pretty much brings us to the end of that issue. And of course, on the editor's desk, we actually had a fairly brief report because Neil Clarke is very busy. That's why I spent most of the time at the front of this episode talking about some of the broader work that Neil Clarke has been doing. So again, as always, if you enjoy anything that you read in Clarkesworld, please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. Or in general, I would hope that this opportunity to talk about short fiction has encouraged you to think about other venues where you enjoy short fiction and ask yourself maybe if there's something you can do to support that publication. In general, too, though, I am going to strongly advocate for more democratic thinking in general, thinking holistically about how we can improve our societies so that we don't have this really strange, fragile economy that includes so many people who are much more aspirational in the way they move through the world, knowing that a lot of old jobs and old economies are no longer providing a kind of stable way forward. If they ever did, that's maybe a conversation for another time. But also that the new economies have not developed enough stability infrastructure to be able to support us in this work. And when I say us, I mean many people from many different cultures with different pressure points, all of which are bearing down especially on a North American market and industry that was not established to fix all of the world's problems and can't. So we as sci-fi writers have an obligation to think much beyond the page in terms of how to build a better, stabler economy for our fiction when we have a world that is stabler for more people and is in a situation where even the worst off are as well off as they can be within that system. Then we can talk about actually having an ecosystem with equity built in. So all of it has to come up together. We'll do that work, not all in one episode, but thank you very much for following along if you did. As always, liking and subscribing really helps with the YouTube algorithm because that's part of the economy we live in. But otherwise, I'm just thankful that you spent time with me today. Cheers to you. Best wishes in whatever you are reading and writing next.